It may come as a surprise to hear that Pharaonic-era life was very up to date. Today, we'll be delving into the daily lives of ancient Egyptians. For instance, men and women were treated equally under the law, and the level of sophistication of their education and healthcare was unprecedented in human history. First things first, though, make sure to subscribe to History Diary for more interesting historic events. Let's fly, and our destination today is Egypt. The Nile River was not only the lifeblood of ancient Egyptian agriculture and textile production, but also the country's principal thoroughfare. Simple skiffs and wooden boats were used by the wealthy and the poor alike to navigate its waters. It was also used to carry the massive blocks of stone needed to construct the pyramids, as well as to convey the remains of high-status citizens in elaborate funeral processions. The Egyptians, however, had to continually be on the lookout for hippos and crocodiles rather than speed traps. While on the Nile, the pharaoh Minos was attacked and murdered by a hippo, and it has been speculated that a hippo also attacked and maybe killed King Tut. Ancient Egyptians had their own special culinary skills as well. They were the first people known to have made beer 18,000 years ago. Egyptians loved their beer, and it was an essential food, so much so that workers were paid in brewer's grain rather than currency. However, ancient Egyptian beer was not the same as what you know now. You could have a couple of bowls for supper without getting into a drunken fistfight with a hippo because it was more like a thick, sweet soup. People in ancient Egypt didn't consume a lot of fish, despite living beside one of the world's mightiest rivers. They consumed almost no meat at all. Wheat and barley were staples in ancient Egyptian cuisine, which makes perfect sense given that the Egyptians were paid mostly in bread and beer. Celery, dates, pomegranates, garlic, and vegetable were just some of the fruits and vegetables that grew in plenty. Even if meat wasn't regularly available, it was nonetheless relished on special occasions like feast days or, for the wealthy, whenever the craving struck. We can infer the Egyptians' regard for health and their level of medical sophistication from their diet choices. So, dental work, gynecological examinations, surgical procedures, and even autopsies were all commonplace in ancient Egypt. Perhaps the final one shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Medical practices were a combined elements of both secular medicine and religious ritual, and they weren't limited to the nobility. It seems that even slaves had access to medical care. The ancient Egyptians knew that leaving a 3-inch layer of sweat, ripe fruit, and grime sticking to one's skin was a breeding ground for illness. Therefore, they placed a premium on personal hygiene. We can say they were so clean and managed to invent their own soaps. They took frequent baths with soap that contained salt as well as oils from animals and plants. It was also usual practice for men and women to have no hair whatsoever, not even on their heads. And sure, France is the country of fragrances now, yet the ancient Egyptians were the first to develop the art. Perfumes were commonly scented with lily, myrrh, and cardamom because cleanliness and a pleasant demeanor were highly esteemed. and by combining citrus and cinnamon, they may have made the first deodorant. While the ancient Egyptians certainly knew a lot about the human body, they certainly didn't know everything there was to know about it. In their view, the heart was the mind and the source of all mental activity. Nearly all cultures hold that the heart is where our most profound feelings, including love, despair, and bravery, are stored. The ancient Egyptians obviously didn't place much value on the brain because they discarded it after mummification. Perhaps they mistook it for ordinary skull filling. As you know by now, gynecology existed as a branch of medicine in ancient Egypt. However, the ancient Egyptians hadn't completely ironed out all the wrinkles, much like the heart versus brain controversy. Birth was understood to be the result of sexual activity, but the womb was thought to be linked to the alimentary canal, the tube from the mouth to the anus. It was common practice to insert a clove of garlic into a woman's sensitive parts as a fertility test, and if the garlic was detectable on her breath, it suggested she was fertile. Any obstacle or blockage that prevented the smell of garlic suggested that having children were not an option now. After giving birth, male infants in contemporary societies get circumcision shortly after birth. In ancient Egypt, though, it served as more of a symbol of entering adulthood. Because of this, it wasn't done until a long time later. If you're curious about the prevalence of nightmares in ancient Egypt, you need go no farther than the temple murals that depict priests carrying out the process on males in their late teens. What role circumcision played in ancient Egyptian culture is uncertain. Most pharaohs, for example, had their circumcisions performed, but the practice was also used to shame prisoners and identify slaves. Similar to their high level of knowledge in medicine, they also gave a great deal to the judicial system. Two separate courts, the Kenbet and the Great Kenbet, handled legal matters in ancient Egypt. While the Great Kenbet dealt with major offenses like robbery and murder, the Lower Kenbet mostly handled lesser offenses. The superior of the pharaoh would usually make the initial ruling, with the pharaoh making the final decision. However, the courts would often defer to the oracle's wills, or, since the oracles never bothered to show up, the statues of the oracles in very difficult instances. In such trials, the prosecution and defense would each write their case on a piece of paper and set it on separate sides of the street. The verdict was determined by which way the statues looked to be leaning more heavily, and the prisoner was sentenced accordingly. That's the most complex example of an entirely random justice system. On the other hand, in ancient Egypt, it appeared that the law treated men and women equally. Women had the right to own property, including slaves and land, and could also sue and get divorced. Furthermore, the Egyptians did not engage in female infanticide, which suggests that female children were valued as much as male children. The procedure of infanticide was popular in other communities during the same time period. Therefore, it may not be as extreme as it first appears. We can only suppose that the Greek commander found this out the hard way when he tried to give an Egyptian aristocratic woman his drink order after the Greeks conquered Egypt and found that she had more independence and civil liberty than Greek ladies. When it comes to education, fairness wasn't their strongest trait. Kids from the upper class were the only ones who got to go to school. Reading, writing, Arithmetic, history, physics, and medicine were among the topics covered in what was essentially a modern-day curriculum. The sons of the pharaoh and the noblest families sent their children to the prince's school. However, there were financial aid opportunities for bright but low-income students. The people of ancient Egypt were able to live lives that were startlingly similar to our own in many respects, thanks to the fact that the country was fairly modern in many respects. Do you aspire to adopt the manners of the ancient Egyptians? Leave a comment and let us know.